Good evening. On behalf of KPCC and Southern California Public Radio, welcome to the Crawford Family Forum. For tonight's program, Unhinging the Closet Doors, a conversation on how culture, class, and faith affect the process of coming out as LGBT, or, in some cases, staying in. And now, your host for this evening, KPCC Take 2 producer and reporter, Leo Duran.
Thank you for all of you who could come out here tonight. You know, part of the reason that we're doing this forum event, it's a little bit of a story, but as a producer reporter for Take 2, I did a little bit of the Proposition 8 DOMA reaction after the Supreme Court struck them both down. And one of the takeaways I had from that is, you know, a lot of people were saying this is a very historic year for LGBT people. A lot of movement has been happening. But, you know, there's a lot of people who said this is a great year for equality, etc. And Dave, I want to bring up the first slide. This is just to give you a sampling of some of the reactions of what celebrities had said about this. And if you take a look at it, there's a recurring theme here. It's about the idea of equality, that, you know, it's a momentous day. You can love who you want to love. But make no mistake, you know, it was a great day. But just because LGBT people can be married, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are accepted. And not even just on the political or legal level. Are they accepted in their homes when they go home for the holidays, where they're even at the checkout in the grocery store? So that brings us to tonight. We wanted to take a look at the idea of LGBT people and the issue of coming out as a rite of passage and the real test of whether your community or your family accepts you. So I wanted to show you guys one example of, you know, what an LGBT person who is coming out today might experience. You know, if you go onto YouTube, there's a whole bunch of kids out there who are secretly recording their parents as they're coming out and then posting it up on YouTube. So here's one example.
Well, I don't know. I'm gay. Surprise. Daniel? Daniel? Why? I know you probably already know, but I want to make it official.
And there's actually a lot of videos that are like that online. It's very encouraging to LGBT people out there. It seems as if they're being more accepted. And that's a reaction that might not have happened about a decade ago, because a lot has changed since then. There's some information from the Pew Research study that I wanted to show you all. And it shows that the number of people, Americans, who say homosexuality should be accepted rose to 57%, up from 47% in 2003. That's a 10-year difference, you know, 1 percentage point each year, which is a really fast rise. But if you also take a look at that, there's still a little over a third who say it should be discouraged by society. That's 36%. So the question is, who's in that group? Perhaps it's a mom or a neighbor or a pastor or a coworker of an LGBT person. So tonight, what I wanted to do with all of you and all of you is have an open discussion about who's it still hard for, who's still within, you know, who's still dealing with that 36% of people that are out there, and what makes it more difficult for them to come out. So I hope that you'll be able to share your own experiences as we talk to our panelists, and sort of describe exactly what are some of the problems, even though 2013 has been very good for the strides in the LGBT community. So I want to introduce our panel in kind of a weird way. I had a chance to talk with all of them ahead of time and grab and understand their whole coming out story. What you're going to hear is a sampling of, you know, just some of the takeaways I had from what they had to say to me, some of what I found unique about their coming out, and of course we're going to hear more from you throughout the entire night. But first, you know, here's our panel, and the first voice you'll hear is of Julian Juarez. So let's take a listen.
I was never sort of like the butch kid who played football and all of that. So my parents had an idea that something was different about me.
I think it wasn't really into middle school when I started having these dreams about this one particular guy. Then I started realizing, like, wait a second, hold on. I don't think this is the norm. You know, I think there's something unusual about this.
I think ever since I was very young, I would crush on girls, and I never really knew that that was different.
I knew you were supposed to have a girlfriend, but that was more like, well, that's what everybody does.
By the time I graduated high school, I felt ready to come out to my parents because I started letting my hair grow out. I started plucking my eyebrows. So I started taking on a more feminine appearance. Before I told my mom that I was gay, I was ready for her to say, I don't get this. You're not my family anymore. Get out of my house. We were sitting down for dinner and I was just sitting with her and I said, Mom, and I just didn't even know how I would describe transsexual to my mom. And my mom is an immigrant from Mexico, so she didn't really speak the language that well. I just decided that the easiest thing would be to just say I'm gay. We both cried about it, and she was good with it. She accepted me, and she was fine. And probably a year after, I said, Mom, I'm actually not gay. I'm transsexual at the time. That was the only word that existed as well. And I'm going to be getting breast augmentation. And there was a silence for a while, and then my mom said, well, as long as you don't get them too big.
My name is Yolo Akili Robinson, mostly known as Yolo Akili. I'm 32 years old. I just started college, so I want to say I was like 19, so I was becoming politicized. Having that period of time when you come home to the parents and you start bringing back, hey, this is all the screwed up things you did to me, etc. And of course, in the context of doing that, my sexuality came up. And this is literally what they said to me. My dad was like, oh yeah, we remember you were wearing your mom's high heels when you were like a little toddler. We were like, okay. They were like, honey, we knew you was gay a long time ago. When you're gay and you're African American, you're contending with a lot of different narratives than you are if you're from another racial or ethnic group. There's this down low discourse operating in our communities. Like, there are not a lot of black men who are of a certain class level, or who are not incarcerated, or who don't embody a certain level of politics or respectability. So all those things I've had to contend with as a black gay man, like black women saying to me, like, you're a waste. Because what can you do for me?
My name is Elisa O. I am 28 years old, and I am a lesbian. I grew up in the church. My parents are both pastors, and my mom, she decided to take me to this conference. The whole conference ended up being about homosexuality and how to pray the gay away kind of thing. And so that night I came out to my mom, and she was so startled because she had no idea. She just didn't want to go alone to this conference. Her reaction was, oh, it's something I did in my parenting, or something I did when I was pregnant must have made you gay. And she was so distraught about it. Well, I told my mom that I couldn't face my dad, to please tell him. I was at home, and he hugged me and he said, we'll get through this. I think I just didn't really know what to think at that point. And I didn't know how to deal with it except to be somebody vulnerable and waiting for someone to help me. I had to come out twice, basically. Once as like an addict wanting to get well. For them, that was a lot more palatable. And I had to come out a second time as someone who has accepted and embraced this part of my identity. And at that point, there were no hugs, you know?
I'm Joe Levy. I'm 84, getting much closer to 85. When I told him I was gay, the first thing my father did was look at my mother and say, it must be your side of the family. All the men on my side of the family are men. And she looked right back at him and said, oh, really? Well, what about your cousin Sydney? And your brother's not married, and they got into this big fight about which side of the family it came from. Until I finally said, hello, this is about me. So I got out pretty easily. But I used to have a fail-safe. If things went terribly wrong, I could always commit suicide. I never actually gave that serious consideration, but it was my way of saying I can get through this. I never thought of myself as being brave, except in retrospect. If I have nothing to hide, I have nothing to be ashamed of. And my mission in life is to normalize it. That's why I tell everybody I'm gay, because everybody I've ever met in my life will have met at least one gay person.
The gay people in the church don't want to come out. And so there's nothing to talk about because nobody knows that they exist in that church. I'm always pressuring people to come out, especially the Koreans at Korean churches. It has to be done for any sort of change to happen.
But I do believe that, like, me sharing it with my father and mother, like for many people, it was really about me feeling kind of like a sense of, affirming a sense of myself.
But the younger generations, they almost don't go through a coming out process. They just are.
that is our panel. Welcome to all of them. This is Joe Levy, directly on my left. He's an 84-year-old member of GLIDE, Gays and Lesbians Initiating Dialogue for Equality. To his left is Drian Juarez. She's a program manager for the Transgender Economic Empowerment Project at the LA Gay and Lesbian Center. Elisa O. She's a filmmaker. She's also a graduate of the Fuller Theological Seminary. And then Yolo Akili on the far end. He's an educator and counselor, and he also writes for sites like the Huffington Post. And I want to first start with Joe here, I guess the elder statesman of our panel, because as part of that story, Joe, what we didn't hear is that you came out in 1963, which is a little bit crazy because that happened well before Stonewall. And as you all heard, it was a very positive experience. I mean, with all the stigma about being gay at the time, why did you think you had it easier?
I don't know.
The microphone.
I really don't know. I think in later years, I mean, looking back, my regret is that while they were alive, I never told my parents how great I thought they were about it. Because at the time, many of you may know, it was both illegal and a mental disease just to be homosexual. You could be in a gay bar, you could be totally straight, and when the police raided the place, you would wind up in the paddy wagon on your way to jail. Your name would be in the paper as some sort of a sex pervert or some such thing, and your life would be pretty much ruined. I also spent 2 years as a Korean War vet, fortunate enough to be stationed in Germany, where I actually had a great time at government expense. Thank you, taxpayers. And it was nerve-wracking. My best buddy was gay. I kind of figured out he was. He didn't know that I was until many, many years later when we got together. But it was so crazy trying to be who you were and keep it all hidden. So I don't know why it was so special when I came out. I think perhaps it may have just been the fact that I was their son. And it was interesting how my father handled it. After all this, your side of the family, my side of the family. And the funny part is that the only gay people I've actually discovered were really on my father's side of the family. So, and I don't even know if he knows that, or knew that. But where was I? Yeah, I think that the whole process, at the end of our talk, he said, well, because I told him at the time I was in a relationship, and it was my first really serious relationship, and I thought, I can't keep pretending, that there's nobody in my life. So I think that was why I told him. And at the end of it, my father said, look, we've always been hospitable to your friends, which was absolutely true. And he said, we'll treat this guy as a friend of yours, he'll be welcome in our home, but don't expect me to treat him like a son-in-law. Well, for 1963, that was pretty damn good.
That's really impressive, yeah.
Interestingly, years later, when I had a different boyfriend, my parents had been in an automobile accident, and after some hospitalization, by the way, I'm from New York, and they chose to go to Atlantic City for a week to just recuperate and have some leisure time. And Bob, who was my boyfriend at the time, and I drove them to Atlantic City, brought them to the hotel where they're going to be staying, and we were planning to leave, and my father said, you'll stay for dinner. So we went to the restaurant. My father said to the head waiter, because they're going to be there for a week, he said, I'm Alvin Levy, this is my wife, Tilly. And he looked at me and he looked at Bob and he said, and these are my boys. And then years later, I was toward the end of her life, I was walking with my mother, and all she said to me was, life must have been very difficult for you. And we never discussed it any more than that, but I was so grateful that she just said those words, and there was so much understanding from these little middle class sort of Jewish people that grew up in a whole different world. Their parents were from other countries, and I'm just amazed at how good they were about it.
It's really impressive. Yolo, very similarly, you had a pretty good experience coming out to your parents, but I want to go more deeper into what we heard just there, where it seems as if more of the reaction you got were from your black female friends. Can you explain a little bit more about that reaction you got, and also just generally culturally from your background, what made it harder?
Well, absolutely. As an African American, me coming out as gay kind of to a lot of heterosexual black women in my community, both older women and women who might have been, possible partners for me, that spelled that like I was taking away from the pool of available black men. When we talk about in the African American community, because of the rates of incarceration, because of a number of pressing social issues, there is considered this idea that there are not a lot of dateable black men for middle class black women, I would say particularly. And so when me being someone who has a college degree and who aspire to different things, it's like, well, now you're a waste because now you can't provide for me and become a part of this family for me. You can't be a black father in this kind of way. You can't be a respectable black man in a certain kind of way. And so I got a lot of what a waste you are. And I think a lot of black men who have come out as gay or queer, bisexual definitely hear that narrative in a way that I'm not sure if other people in different ethnic communities hear that.
And what did you say to these women who said that to you?
Well, initially I was just shocked. It's something really jarring because, particularly if I'm struggling with my sexuality, hear somebody say you're a waste, and I began to internalize that, to really feel like I was worthless, I had no points, no particular point or nothing I could contribute to the community because I wasn't able to fulfill this nuclear family dream. And over time, of course, I got a little more witty with it, right? I was what's my, I would have different comebacks to say to that, but initially it was very hurtful. It was very, very painful.
Elisa, I want to turn to you for your experience in the Korean American church that you came from. And, help us understand exactly what that means and how that community, essentially, when you came out to your parents, as you told me, you kind of had to come out to that whole congregation. Tell us more about that.
Like I said when I talked to you, I came out at a conference. It was basically an ex-gay, or teaching the leaders of the ex-gay sort of movement how to incorporate that therapy into their church communities. And so I was very afraid of coming out because I felt like my parents would be crushed. And not only my parents, but their place in the community is so important. And
they ran a Korean American church.
Right. They're both pastors of a Korean American church, a second generation Korean American church. And I think once when I came out to my mom at the conference, it was very much, like I said, it was a lot of, I must have done this to make you gay. And it was just a lot of kind of guilt on her end. And which is kind of difficult to understand because I tell her that I'm gay and she blames herself. You don't really know how to respond to that. Once both my parents found out, the next step was automatically to go through ex-gay therapy. So that was just a given. And for me, I was in a place, I was very, I was sheltered in a Korean American community, church community, and so it made sense to me too that that's what I wanted. I wanted to be straight, and I think the idea of an ex-gay therapy group was ideal because then that meant there was a solution and it wasn't something permanent that my parents would, kind of.
And this is also a way for you to stay within that Korean American church community because, as you mentioned to me, that these are like your aunties, your uncles, this is your whole world. Exactly. And if you push them aside, you have nothing left.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah.
And Drian, very similar to Elisa, you kind of had a two-step coming out process as well. Elisa had to come out once as, yes, please fix me, I guess is the best way to phrase it, and then finally accepting it. And in your case, tell us more about that linguistic barrier you first struggled with, just even the language of explaining to your mother what is transsexual is at the time, transgender, and why you first came out as gay. It seemed as if almost impulsive, like, okay, I'm just going to go with this because it seems like it's the right time.
I was thinking about that this weekend, and for me, I think it was a two-step coming out process, but it was my youth and my adulthood, because as a child, I saw myself as female, and when I went to school, I thought I was a girl. And very quickly, I started getting picked on and called names. And when I asked my mother what words like sissy and faggot meant, I could tell that it wasn't a positive thing. But also my mom's way of protecting me was to say, well, don't behave that way. Don't say you want to be a girl. Don't say you want to wear pink. Don't do this, don't do that. So immediately as a child, I learned that there was something wrong with me. And so I hid that part of myself. And so when I came out to my mom as an adult, I came to that situation knowing or feeling how I felt as a kid, being shut down and being told that, no, you cannot be this. And so for me, I felt the only way I could explain it was to talk about gay, because that was something my mother was more familiar with, and trans was just so new, and there were no role models. And living in East Los Angeles, there were no LGBT gay community, nothing. So I just didn't know where to turn or where to go or how I would even communicate this to my mother. So.
Mm-hmm. And so when you came out first as gay, her reaction was pretty positive. Then what led up to the point where you thought, a year later, I'm just gonna have to tell her? As you heard, it was very kind of, she seemed okay with it.
Yes.
Do you think had you come out as transgender first, she would have had that same reaction? It seems as if she almost kind of knew.
Yes, and I think I could have, but for me, because I lived such a sheltered life, I would come home and lock myself in my bedroom, and I wouldn't come out other than for dinner. And I really wouldn't have conversations with my family because, again, I just didn't want them to see me. Out in the world, I was very gender variant. I had a very androgynous presentation, but when I would come home, I would try to hide that as much as possible. And so for me, I just didn't think my mother knew. But when I told her, she, her reaction was incredibly positive, and for her it was, she told me, well, finally you told us. We knew something was up, but we didn't want to push you. And so parents know to a certain degree, and I think it's just about the cues that we get about whether it's okay to come out or say anything.
Mm-hmm. You also have an extended family, so when you came out to your mother, she maybe understood some of this language, but you have extended family originally from Mexico. Did you talk to them about this? Did you think like maybe they'll understand this too?
No, and to this day, I don't really speak with them. And it's interesting with Facebook now, I'm sort of connected to them through Facebook, but I really haven't had a dialogue with them. And my mom tells me that, my uncles and my aunts ask about me, and they see pictures of me, but because I've had such a disconnect from them for so long that it's me more than anyone. I have a hard time breaking through that and speaking with them, and it's always felt that way with my family for some reason.
So I want to get into some issues where I've been bringing other listeners into this conversation. And one of the most interesting things I've found in this research is the idea of elderly LGBT people. Dave, can you bring up the slide from the Pew Research Center, where here's a graph detailing exactly when people are coming out. If you take a look at the graph, the median age there is about 20. But if you take a look towards the right, there are a couple of data points there of people coming out in their 60s or 70s, which, not usually the norm of what you think of when people are coming out. And so one of the people I heard from comes from our Public Insight Network. She shared this story of one of her own clients.
My name is Julie Siri. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. The example that comes to mind was a very active gentleman, and he'd been with his partner for over 50 years. His partner died. The people in the nursing home didn't understand his relationship and why that loss was so significant. And he was afraid to tell them. And he did experience some of the staff referring to him as a faggot and a fruit and things like that.
And so there's that story of an elderly person who was out, and in this case, he decided to go back into the closet because of the facility where he was at. Joe, I'm hoping you can explain this. Help us understand what are some of the reasons why an elderly person might have struggles coming out or just even being out.
I'm guessing, because I'm not in that position. I can't speak from my own experience. But I would think that once we get to a certain age, it's almost like going back to childhood. We need help. We need somebody to look after us. We need people to be careful about us. We need people to know that we're okay, or that, something needs help, or we can't get by on ourselves. And I think, I mean, now young people are coming out sooner. You know, I speak for Glide. We go to schools and we talk about homophobia. And in the 14 or so years that I've been doing that, I see a big change in the students. I think it was Fairfax High School or something even had a male prom queen. And so, I mean, things are getting a little bit more open and more accepting. But going back into a situation where you're slightly out of control, such as a nursing home or a retirement village or whatever, you don't know what you're going to meet. These people are going to be your friends. These people are going to be your associates all the time that you're there. You can't depend on the weekly visit from your children, or occasionally a grandchild shows up. So you're depending on these people for your support, your emotional support and whatever, and you don't know how they're going to react. Older people my age, and even some younger, know what it was like back in the day when you really had to be ashamed, and you were taught to be ashamed, and we knew that we were not okay. We learned that. Anybody know the song from South Pacific, You Have to Be Carefully Taught, which is about racism. It's also about a child's acceptance. If you tell the child he's not acceptable, there's something wrong with him, he needs to be fixed, he's going to live with that. For me, it took a lot of therapy before I actually spoke to my parents about it. And we didn't even discuss it in therapy. I just felt, well, I'm really okay. They'll deal with it. So I think that may be the big problem with.
So even though, again, this year, I mean, there's been a transformation for people who are accepting of homosexuality. They
Yes.
see this in the news. They see that they can get married.
Yes.
Why would they still want to hold back despite that environment?
Well, I can talk about two freedoms. It's not exactly answering your question as you phrased it. But I met two guys at a party, 50 some odd, I think it was around 1960 I met them. They were just starting to go together. One was a scientist, the other one was a lawyer for an insurance company. They were very guarded about their sexuality. When they retired at 65, they moved in together for the first time. They'd been together for years and years. They moved into the same house. They built another apartment for the one who was moving in. So it looked like he was a tenant or just sharing a home. It went on and on and on and on, and I was always pushing them to come out. In fact, we went to Hawaii together in the 70s, and I insisted they go to this cave on, I don't know if it was Maui or Kauai. It was considered a wedding cave where people went to get married. And so I was always teasing them and pushing them. And once one of them said to me, in fact, one of them, when I told him that I had spoken to my parents about being gay, his response was, "Why would you want to do something like that to hurt your parents?" That was his reaction. They never came out a lot. They just assumed that everybody would figure it out. Their families, their friends, their straight friends. Everybody knows, we don't have to tell them. Surprise of surprises, last year at the age of 90, both of them are 90, they got married in New York State, and they had a party, and that was their way of coming out. Not to say, guess what, we're gay. It's like, oh, we're married. Go figure it out.
Do you think they needed to even come out? I mean, if it was just for themselves, why even come out?
They really didn't need to, because everybody pretty much knew. In fact, even their straight friends, and some of my friends became their friends. It was almost like a joke. You know, do they really think we don't know? And but if they were comfortable with that, they were comfortable with that. I mean, that was, I guess, they just couldn't bring it themselves to say, I'm gay. So I can't always speak for somebody else, just my experience of them.
Right. Well, speaking of people who can't come out to say that they're gay, I want to also show you another data point that we brought up. Dave, can you bring up this New York Times article about people who, well, specifically men who are, I guess for better, lack of better terminology, who are on the down low. This researcher actually tried to figure out the number of men who identify as gay and then contrasted that with the number of men who look for porn online. And there's actually a difference there. Can you bring up the next slide with some of the stats on this? So in this case, let's take, for example, that first graph right there. In the groups of states where all males said that they were actually homosexual, 2.6%. If you take a look at what they actually Googled online, 5.4%. And it doesn't necessarily suggest that they are gay, but maybe they're just searching for it. But it does sort of indicate that there is a closet of some form. And I want to turn this over to you, Yolo. I mean, there is that issue of being on the down low. So, why is it important for somebody who is on the down low? Do they need to come out as gay? Can they just essentially be interested in having sex with men without that identifier?
Absolutely. Well, the first piece I think is important is that to talk about is the down low as a concept, this idea of men who are who desire other sexual relationships with men but are still with women are kind of like not open about that. That is often very racialized. Like people hear down low, they think black men, right? Mm-hmm. But the reality is this type of behavior has been happening across cultures and races and ethnicities for a very, very long time, right? So that's the first piece I would think about it. The second piece I would say is I think there's something, I remember reading this article and thinking a number of things. And one of the things I was thinking is that there's an assumption that because one has a same-sex desire, whatever that is, or whatever to whatever degree, that constitutes one being gay. Does that make sense? So like, for instance, if I'm a person and I may be attracted to women or men to a varying degree, now the culture says that like, you have to be gay. It's like the one drop rule. Like you're one drop of black, you're black. If you have one same-sex encounter, you're gay. You know what I mean? Particularly for men, maybe less so for women. And I think that the article kind of speaks to one, not just about like how many men are gay, but it speaks to the potential realities of the sexual fluidity of our culture. Like we tend to think very strict about it's gay, straight, all right, and bi are kind of off to the side, right? When the reality is when we really look at our sexual experiences and our desires and our longings, they're much more complicated. Like, I had relationships with women when I was in middle school, but like it's the one drop rule, you're gay now. None of that ever happened. Like, you know what I mean? So like our sexualities are very kind of like rigid. And so I think that article really speaks to not only the realities of the ways in which like stigma still very much so exists in our country. Mm-hmm. Just because we see these things on the media, we have Glee, all these other different things. The reality is in a lot of rural and suburban areas, it's the climate hasn't changed much. But that article also speaks, I think, to the fluidity and diversity of sexualities and the ways in which sometimes we don't recognize that even as gay people, we do it, and straight people do it as well. Like, really enforcing, like, oh, he had sex with a guy once, or he thought that was attractive, this particular act that is associated with gay sex, so now he's gay. You know what I mean? Like, our sexuality is much more complicated. Our genders are much more complicated. And I think that article and that research really speaks to that, if anything else.
And does that speak to how when we frame LGBT people, it's almost as if here's a specific category. It's a political category, it's a social category. But when it comes to your own personal sexual experience, it can be a range of different issues, and it doesn't necessarily fit within a specific letter.
Absolutely. And it's also like, it's really interesting too, because it's like straight people and the alphabet people, like everybody else. Like, it's just like, that's the way it's kind of like positioned in culture. It's become its own binary. And there's a way in which even the LGBTQ umbrella, like really just erases a lot of the diversity of experience within those groups, And so I think that there have been a lot of discourse and a lot of literature that's kind of like coming out in pop culture, like on the Good Men Project. There's a great article. There's a lot of articles around. The Huffington Post shares a lot of material on it as well about the reality of, our sexual experiences and our sexual identity. Some people change over time. And just because in sexual practice, sexual desire and sexual identity are three different things. Mm-hmm. So what I desire may be different from what I practice. How I practice may be different from how I identify. And that might be for me as a gay man or a queer person, as a trans person. I think there's a real conversation about the fluidity of sexuality that we need to move into and kind of question our commitment to making people gay or straight so rigid, like making it so hard, Right.
Actually, on that, I want to bring up the idea of people who are bisexual, none of which of you are, as far as I know. And when it comes to the bisexual experience, I want to share the story of my friend Jim. And for all intents and purposes, he does consider himself bisexual, but it's something he actually doesn't readily admit in front of his gay friends for a specific reason. Can you?
Yeah, there was a conversation just a few months ago, and I was with a couple of gay friends, and they were talking about a guy who was in a gay bar and took a wedding ring off. And they were like, oh yeah, what, in this day and age, why is he bothering doing that? And I said, well, maybe he's bi. And he said, well, I highly doubt that could be possible. Do I be like, well, wait a sec, why are you saying that? And sort of bring up my example? But I didn't. Like, I try not to make a big deal out of it. Maybe I should.
So there's this idea that bisexuality doesn't even exist. And here's another article that I want to bring up. It's also written by a different friend of mine. Her name is Lux, and she talked with different bisexual people, and here's what one person actually said. Liz, she says people consider her, she's just super slutty, she's indecisive, she's greedy, she's closeted. But, if you come out as bisexual, you're not even just, you're facing some discrimination from people within the LGBT community itself. Dreon, I'm hoping you can address this, because essentially if you aren't part of that traditional narrative of being or lesbian or gay, if you're bisexual, if you're transgender, asexual, etc., what are some of the struggles that you face in coming out? How does that make it different?
Well, I think that in particular, especially heterosexually identified transgender women who date heterosexually identified men experience that same kind of invalidation. And that's why so many men who date transgender women stay in the closet, or date trans women who aren't read as trans, who pass as cisgendered women. And it's often that fear of, oh, you're dating somebody who might have a different body part than what we're used to seeing on women, so therefore you must be gay. And so I think that even the men who date trans women who are straight have that same experience of, in their own communities, being invalidated. And in gay communities also, when we go to gay bars with our partners, then it's thought that they're gay because they're dating a trans woman. So even our partners have that similar experience.
How important is it for transgender people, for bisexual people, to be out among their friends, regardless of the fears that they might have, just so more of those stories come out there? Because it seems as if part of it just comes from a lack of experience, lack of public knowledge about this.
I think it's extremely important, because I think that's where a lot of the change happens, when you have a one-on-one conversation with somebody that's real, that's in depth, and that's with somebody that you care about, that's somebody in your inner circle. I think that makes a much greater impact than seeing a social media campaign or anything like that. So those conversations are really where the change happens.
I also want to touch on something that you do for your actual work. You deal with work employment, and you also train employers on how to be sensitive to this situation. I want to play a story from another person in our Public Insight Network. Her name is Chris Almvig, and she's from Kansas. And she told me the story about how in the 1970s she was out and she was part of this public panel at a university, and talked about the problem it created at her job.
And so, it was terrific being on this panel, and I became sort of a celebrity in the women's movement here and all. But the next day, I could see my boss in the window of his office, and I could see his face was all red, and the veins in his neck were bulging out, and I knew what was in store for me. And he ran to me at the front door and said, get out, pack up your stuff, and get out of here. We'll mail you your check.
So that's a very extreme example of the kind of workplace discrimination people face. What are some of the struggles in coming out on the job? I mean, that's a whole different arena than coming out to your parents. What are the struggles that are out there, and has that changed over the years?
I think it's people's lack of understanding of sex and gender identity. So when somebody, especially if they've had a long history in that job, it's hard for people to make the switch that this is, for example, a trans woman, somebody who is male in the workforce and transitioned to female, for other people to wrap around their heads around the concept that this is a transgender woman. And what I like to say to people is that I've never been male. I have no idea what that's like. I have always been a transgender woman. It's just that I didn't always have the language to communicate that to people. And so people have a hard time getting out of their own concept of what you are and accepting you for who you are.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, when it comes to your experience with your family members, I mean, there's that specific language that you told me about when it came to homosexuality, the way it was described in church. Can you describe that for us, and what was your reaction to it? That one sermon where they said, here's what homosexuality is, and you discovered what it was for yourself, what it was the first time for yourself.
Right. I think that the first time I even kind of put together the idea of homosexuality was through a sermon when I was in junior high, and the youth group, the pastor did his whole a sermon about how this is what homosexuality is, and it's wrong, and he kind of phrased it in a way that it was so far removed from the reality of our group that it was something that he just considered the other. And so for me to recognize that in myself as something that I identified with, it was really scary, because I realized, oh, I'm a part of the other when I'm so part of this group as well. And I didn't know how to reconcile the two sort of ideas.
I mean, this is decades later or years later, but does that language still exist now in the church?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that regardless of kind of the progress that we make, as a country, the church communities, especially the Asian American church communities, are very isolated from this sort of progress. I think as far as Korean American communities are involved, there aren't very many people who come out in the Korean American circles. And when they do, and if they do, they usually step away from the church community, and so nobody has to talk about them.
And when you say that they're isolated, are they isolated because of language, because of geography? Why are they isolated from other Christian churches?
I think that when they hear about, oh, gay marriage is legal. I mean, with my parents, when it was legal in California, for them, because in sort of the Christian culture, it's very resistant to secular culture, right? So it's like a different sphere. So for them, it's easy for them to isolate themselves from kind of the society.
I think we also want to make sure that all of you get a chance to share any stories you have. Elaine I can't see her, it's so dark in here. And she's wearing black, so it doesn't help. But Elaine is right there. If you do have any questions for her, please raise your hand. If you are mulling about it, go ahead. But before we can get to that, I want to ask one further question, is that this idea of progress. And this is something I ended up seeing online on the website Reddit the other day. If you can just bring up this snapshot I took, where people were asking each other about coming out. If you had more LGBT siblings in your family, what was it like? And one thing I really took away was from one of the very top responses. If you can see this one by Orko 1995, he talks about how his mother was in tears for days, his dad took it better, but clearly they weren't satisfied and they were in some stress. They both talked openly of how disappointed they are that the chance of them having grandchildren just dropped. And I thought about that, and it's not an issue of whether it was morally acceptable or whether it was culturally acceptable. It's just we aren't going to get grandkids. Drian, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because this is something you kind of almost experienced yourself when you came out. Just tell us more about that story.
Sure. As a Latina trans woman and being the firstborn, there's a lot of pressure, to be the breadwinner, to get married, to have grandchildren. And for me, when I came out, it was the experience of almost letting my parents down, because I wasn't that for them anymore. And so they lost that child who was going to give them all of that. And it took a while for me to really sort of get good with the idea that, I can adopt. I can have a variety of different families that maybe don't look like what my parents' relationship or families look like, but there's still a family unit there. But because parents don't see examples of that, they think that they've lost all that family unit is no longer there for them.
Do you think that because of responses like that, of what we just saw of online, do you think that does mark progress? That there's more people who, it's more or less they're accepting of their children. Just, oops, we don't get grandkids out of it.
Definitely. And when you see, celebrities who are happily married, adopting children and having their own family, I think that touches families' hearts and souls and lets them know that they're not giving up on a family, but their family just might look a little different. So.
Joe, when you told me your story, it was also important to you that, and actually this runs across all four of you, I believe, the idea of when you're coming out, it's all about that independence. You did it when you were 33, I believe, and you were living on your own. Drian, you did it when you were in college. I think, Elisa, did you do it when you were in college as well, too? Okay, and same thing for you as well. Why, Joe, why is it important to have that independence? And, and if kids are coming out at a younger age, is that independence necessary? Why is that an important part of the coming out experience for you?
I think the difference is the age. I was 34. I wouldn't recommend it to somebody who was 15 or 16 and still depending on their parents for, just their living conditions and education and security. It's still today, it's I don't know the word crapshoot. It's gambling if you don't really know your parents well. For a while, I was helping out on the Trevor Project, which is an organization that's basically about young kids and coming out and how to help them or advise them not to. And I would answer emails from all over the country, little teeny tiny towns I never heard of. And it was very difficult. I would do research and try to find some sort of a church or religious group or a PFLAG or some organization that could help them. Just help them to know that they were safe and okay. But we could never, ever say, oh, just tell your parents. Tell your best friend, because we don't know what the reaction would be. And why do you want to take a teenager or a preteen and set them adrift? It's like putting them out on a desert island, with no escape. It's still dangerous. I mean, still people are being killed. We're just recently, looking again at, I think his name was Larry King, that boy up in Oxnard, who shot the other kid in school because the other kid was openly gay, somewhat on the feminine side, and said to Larry, would you be my Valentine? And his response was, I'll tell you tomorrow, came back with his father's gun, shot and killed this boy. And he's still, I think, in jail or something. I think
Larry was the boy who was killed,
Yeah, and I got them backwards. And but destroyed 2 families. I mean, really, it's that dangerous that somebody's going to kill you. So I think a lot of it has to do with education, which we're now finally getting from celebrities who are coming out, people like PFLAG, and I think it's GLSEN, which is the Gay and Lesbian Teachers Network. There are gay-straight alliances in some of the schools. It's changing a lot. We live in Los Angeles, folks. It may not be changing in some small town in the Midwest or in Texas or, where things are a little bit different. Especially now, everybody has guns. So you're really putting your life on the line if you come out not knowing how safe you will be.
Yola, I see you nodding your head a lot there.
Yeah, as you were talking, Joe, I was thinking about, and kind of drawing this back to the conversation we were having earlier about the kind of bisexuality, I was thinking about that fear, that deeply rooted fear that comes up when, so for instance, thinking about like straight identified individuals who come across queer or gay people, and there's this fear, this reaction that gets triggered that leads to a violent act. Like, what is the core of that fear? It makes me also think about the same kind of fear I feel like often happens around bisexuality in our communities, with the need to police, you need to be gay or straight. I think that oftentimes there's a real fear that I've experienced in the gay community around the fear of what if I have an attraction to a woman, if that makes sense. So for instance, I've been around many of my gay friends, and we talk about this sometimes, we'll be in a space and we'll be like, oh, she's attractive. I don't know what to do with that. I'm gay. What did I do with that? Or, because once again, we've been taught very rigidly, this is your box. You have to live in it. And we need to police bisexual people to get into a box. And straight people do the same thing to themselves, right? Policing each other, wait a second, why are you doing that? You're getting outside the straight box. You need to get back in that gay box, So there's kind of there's this really intense fear around those categories, around these boxes that we police each other almost violently around, right? Violently around those gender roles. And I think that a part of that, of course, is with gender socialization in our country, the rigid gender socialization that we receive, that is trauma that pushes us into these categories and teaches us to defragment parts of ourselves. That when you face queerness, when you face trans identity, all that stuff is triggered. You know what I mean? When you meet someone who's trans, there's a way in which I feel like a lot of people talk about my fear of what if that's in me? People talk about if I'm meeting a queer person, what if I could be attracted to Yola? What if he's attracted to me? What does that mean about who I think I am? There's this really deeply rooted fear around sexuality, which I think creates a lot of the violence that we see around gender policing, which I thought was just a really important piece to bring into that.
By the way, would you identify as gay, queer?
I identify as queer because I can acknowledge and embrace that, like, I have attractions to various different people, like who are women identified, who are trans identified, who are male identified. You know, I can embrace my attractions on the spectrum. You know, I understand that, like, I primarily have relationships with cisgender men. However, I'm very aware and not afraid to acknowledge that, like, oh my God, I'm attracted to this lesbian woman. Like, what does that mean for me? Like, and just because that attraction doesn't necessarily result in me having sex with or having a relationship with this person forever, that doesn't mean that attraction is any less valid or any less important in the context of me understanding who I am and my sexual reality. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. No, go ahead, please.
Interestingly, I've always been very, very attracted to girls, females, women. I just enjoy doing things with them that you can do with your clothes on. And
that's a lot of stuff.
And everybody who knows me knows this story. When I was 7 years old, my father took me to see a Fred Astaire movie, Fred and Ginger. And Fred Astaire taught me how to be with a woman, okay? He never put his hands on them except to hold them in a dance position. He never kissed them. He fell in love with Ginger at first sight. She rejected him until the music started. All he had to do was twirl her around a few times and she was gaga over Fred. That was my learning, my teaching about how to be with a girl. And I enjoyed being with the girls. I became a decent dancer. I taught dancing and whatever. But it affected my whole life because it gave me a way of being with the girls to whom I was attracted. As I said, I just wanted to keep my clothes on. And they can keep theirs on. And so in a way, I mean, I think, talking about what Yola was talking about, I think the problem is not our sexual orientation, not our gender identity. I think what the problem is, the names. If we're not called bisexual, we're not called gay, we're not called straight, and we're not called 50-50 or whatever, it's just what we do and what we like. I mean, why can't I say, oh, I think you're cute, and have to say I'm gay with that? Why can't I say, you know, oh, I think she's adorable, even if I don't want to go to bed with her? It's just a matter of how I feel, how I react to somebody. What difference does it make what the terminology is? I think that's what keeps us hung up.
Should we open up the floor for questions for people that might have them?
Oh, sure. And give your name, and I'll hang on to it.
Oh, okay. My name is Reynold. This is radio, so let me say I'm a white baby boomer.
Hi.
And I was raised Southern Baptist. I came out to my family in 1979. And I have found, listening to different stories from people from different cultures, and also let me say, I'm very, very far removed from the immigrant experience, that when I hear these stories from people from different cultures, I feel very connected because my parents grew up in a nation where it was against the law, where people were locked away in insane asylums if they were gay. And I want to be culturally sensitive. I want to be supportive. And how can I do that? You know, it seems like there's a little bit of a resistance, a little bit of, I don't know, I don't want to sound arrogant or that I'm being a bulldozer about, well, you need to come out. Because I know when I was young, being gay was like joining a cult. There was a lot of peer pressure to come out. So what Joe said earlier, I really appreciate him stating that you need to time the time that you come out, as opposed to when I was young, where you just came out and that was it, and you let your family just not speak to you for a few years, even if you were 17 or something.
Can I ask you, by the way, so what prompted you to come out during that time? I mean, 1979, still not very welcoming.
I was part of a gay club in college, and we really believed that we came out for ourselves, we came out for our community, we came out for the generation that was going to come out after us. So there was a lot of enthusiasm about coming out, and a certain amount of naivete. And I would say in a regular meeting at this club, there would be maybe 50 students there, and about 25 of us were not speaking with our families. And let me just say, now I go to PCC. I'm pretty familiar with the Gay Straight Alliance that's at PCC, And there's probably 50 people who come to every one of their meetings, and maybe 2 of them aren't speaking to their family. It's much more unusual now.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to this, I don't know if either you or one of you want to answer this. This is something that I seemingly took away from the idea of the immigrant experience versus your experience, who is white and a baby boomer, is that the issues that you dealt with during your day of 1979, it seems as if there are some cultures that are dealing with that right now, that they're kind of lagging behind where I guess the white culture might have been in the past before. I don't know, maybe Elisa, Yolo, or Jurian. I mean, can you address that? Do you feel as if you come from an immigrant experience where you come from a different culture, it's a totally different world than where America was, or it may be very similar to where America was back in like the 1980s or 1970s.
Well, I know that in Latin culture, it's just seen as you're lesser than. So if you come out as trans, well, then you're lesser than, the heterosexual counterpart. So I think that's always the stigma that all of a sudden, no matter what you've done, what your career is, if you are outed as LGBT or trans, then you all of a sudden become lesser than. And I think that's
still
the
persists.
stigma. Definitely, with more traditional families, definitely.
And Lisa, what's your takeaway on that?
I think the difficulties with kind of being part of the immigrant family community. There's sort of that language barrier, like Trian was talking about, where at this point, in at least a lot of my friends, we speak broken Korean or broken Asian language, and our parents speak broken English, and so it's kind of a difficulty in trying to figure out what the right words are. I know several gay lesbian people who they just won't come out because they don't know how to say it without being really kind of so basic that it's kind of almost vulgar. It would be very vulgar to their parents. I think that's always an interesting thing, that language, it's so simple, but it's such a barrier for people to come out. It's a big difficulty. Yeah.
And Yolo?
Yeah, I just like to offer some nuance on the perspective that the white community is, less homophobic than other communities of color or ethnic communities. I think it's much more nuanced and complicated than that. And I think there's often a public perception that, all the white people love gay people. And I'm like, well, I know lots of white people who do not like it. And I think that there's a way in which, because of the ways in which people of color and ethnic communities are often racialized, that the homophobia that appears in our communities is often exasperated, it's presented as if it's more viral, it's more visceral, etc. And that's not necessarily the case. There's a multitude of ways in which homophobia enacts and shows up, and I think that this myth that there's always this kind of this myth of progress, wow, this is 2013, why are we still here? Where it's this is assumption that everybody moved. You know what I mean? Yeah. When the reality is maybe a few epicenters of culture in the United States may have moved, but this country is very diverse. It's very comprised of just different cultural and religious groups that have not moved and shifted just because what we see on television tries to tell us that that's what's happened. And so I think that we have to really kind of be very clear and be very open and honest about the nuances and the complicated ways in which homophobia is operating in all communities, and be intentional about not trying to portray white communities as not having problems or as being better, because that homophobia shows up in a particular way that's different from the ways it shows up in my community or in Latino communities or in Asian communities, because it's all there, it's intertwined, it just looks different.
Joe, what did that actually look like back in 1963, and how does it look different now?
I don't really know that I'm sure about that. I went to school pretty much with Caucasian kids. We were different because we came from different parts of Europe, either our parents or grandparents. I remember we had a Chinese girl named Rose Lee in our class, and we elected her queen of the prom. There were a few black kids in school. It was before black kids were were African American, and they were called colored, and there were different descriptions for them. But we didn't know that much about their communities. We didn't know much about what their thinking was because we weren't raised with them. I learned a little bit more when I was in service, because I was in service with black men. And I realized we were all doing the basic thing. We were serving our country in whatever ways we did. Yet, as a gay man, when I was discharged, I didn't have the same privileges or the same rights as straight white men. And the black soldiers certainly didn't have the rights that white men had. And in fact, basic training was down in Georgia. It was 1951, and I got a taste of sitting in the back of the bus and the colored restrooms and the white this and the colored that and the whatever. And coming from New York, I had heard about it, but it just seemed so weird to me, that people were treated that way. But I had no idea about what it was like being different from heterosexual in other communities.
What about when it comes to just the discrimination you'd see then and now for yourself? You might have seen discrimination as a homosexual back in 1963. Do you see the same kind of discrimination nowadays? How's it changed?
Well, it's hard for me to answer that too, because I was not out. So most of the people I knew did not know that I was gay. In fact, including my best buddy in the Army, who was gay. My parents didn't know. I was dating a lot of girls and danced a lot. And there were, in fact, as an adult, there were 3 or 4 women that I was dating who were all friends of each other's. There was Joyce, there was Nita, there was Zelma, and there was one other one, Barbara, I think. And when I told Nita that I was gay, which was on the way back from a ski weekend where we were together, and I told her I was gay, she said, "Really? That's wonderful." I was like, "What's so wonderful?" And she said, "Well, you date Joyce, and you date Zelma." She named all the other girls, and she said, "You're the best date in town." She said, "You know how to order, you open doors, you do this, you buy corsages, and she said, "But you never follow through. We thought you were asexual." I'm so glad that you were something. But my friends tended to be educated people and whatever, and it was just maybe the people I chose as friends, and they knew me as a friend. They didn't know me as a faggot. They didn't know me as a gay guy. They knew me as a friend, and now they learned something else about me that they didn't know before.
I think I saw a question over there.
Hello, my name is Moya Bailey. I really wanted to return to the questions about how different people of color are responding to coming out narratives and also that history. I'm thinking about the Harlem Renaissance as a time where there are lots of black people who were queer and that wasn't necessarily a problem and it was accepted in the community. And also the way that colonization has impacted the way that traditionally many people of color have had multiple genders in their communities, multiple sexualities, and how a lot of that was lost through colonization. And I just wondered if anybody on the panel wanted to speak to that.
For me, my first point of empowerment was when I learned about the Native American Two-Spirit tradition. Up until then, I thought I was the biggest freak in the world because I wasn't a gay male and I wasn't a female. I didn't know what I was. And when I started doing research and learned that there was such a thing as Two-Spirit, I felt like, oh my God, this is me. I'm meant to be trans. I'm meant to be this way. And I finally felt a sense of pride. But up until my 20s, I had never heard of anything like that, not in school, not anywhere. And so definitely, especially I think for trans people, our identities were demonized through colonization, and our traditions were also demonized through colonization.
One of the things that came to mind when you raised that question, it made me think about Africa historically and the association of homosexuality or no homosexuality in Africa. And so my undergraduate studies were in African American studies and women's studies. And one of the things you see that happened is these European anthropologists went to these different various areas in Africa and they said, "Do you have homosexuals?" And people don't understand that, this particular point in history, the concept of a homosexual was not a universal concept. It was really new. It had just been created. So they would be like, we don't even know what that is. Like, it's not to say that there wasn't same-sex behavior happening in these communities. It was just that, like, there was no descriptor for someone who would marry a man and be in a family unit. That was unheard of. And so that's one of the unique ways in which, like, that history now has kind of come into Africa. Like, there are no homosexuals in Africa, there were no gay men, has come out of this kind of, like, imposition of this kind of cultural narrative of this is what a homosexual is, or this is the idea of a homosexual, which has now created this kind of discourse in black communities, which comes from that kind of history, that, like, black men aren't gay. Black men aren't supposed to be gay because black men are real men or rigid men, you know what I mean? Like, and so definitely you see the ways in which, racism and colonization help construct these narratives that make it more difficult for us in our communities to kind of address coming out and embracing our sexualities.
My name is Vivian, and I've always been, I've always known that I had a same-sex attraction to women very early on. It wasn't until around the early 70s that my mom had asked me, she's like, I don't see any men, any boys coming around, and what's going on? And I finally fessed up. So I was always comfortable with that until they started to try to fix me and send me to Christian counselors and so on and so forth, and something was wrong. It was a perversion and abomination and so on and so forth for many years, which led me to cheat on a lot of my girlfriends for a very long time. I went into the entertainment business for a very long time, and I was able to come out and accept myself. My partner's here. And one of the things that was interesting to me very recently, I ran in a political campaign in a race for the very first time. Mm-hmm. And one of my dear friends, who was the vice president of the school board in the city where I live, said, no, what are you gonna do? Are you gonna run as a gay candidate? And I don't know if that's a good thing. And I thought it was kind of weird because everybody that knows me knows who I am, and I've always been very proud of what I am. And so she said, well, are you going to run as the gay candidate? And I said, I really hadn't thought about it, but in order to get different political action committees to back you, you sort of have to come out, because then they put it on all of your literature. Well, I sort of thought it was kind of like a novel idea, and I thought, I don't want to do that. I'll just run a clean slate and go forward that way. And so we came back to the question where she said, well, do you want to run as a bisexual? Because I think that, that would even be worse for you if you said that you were a bisexual candidate. And it was just puzzling to me because, it's a community that's very close to downtown Los Angeles, and we have a gay bar, and it's there's not a lot, but it was kind of interesting to me to run as a candidate, but I didn't run as a gay candidate. And so I like that you said unhinging the closet doors, and if America has come so far, why is coming out still so hard? And I wonder that as now a new city council member, I'm like, wow. What if I had run as a gay candidate? Would I have lost my seat? And the mayor of that town was saying, we cannot have a gay council person in our city. But luckily, she did not prevail.
What I find interesting about your story, by the way, is this idea of that, for many of these, for our panelists here and maybe for people in our audience, the idea of coming out is this personal experience between their family members. And I'm intrigued with your example. Coming out was kind of between you and the whole voting community. And it became this, I guess, this token. Is coming out, I mean, how do you frame your coming out? Do you think that are you always coming out? Do you think this is part of your coming out story? This is just one example, even beyond just what you did with your family members?
Yeah, it is. It is kind of a coming out story of sorts, because I had to talk to everybody and kind of, find out, gauge everybody's feelings about it, including my family, including my girlfriend. Her and I have been together 10 years, and as you can see, we're an interracial couple, so that threw a whole nother thing into the mix. And strangely enough, the day of the swearing in, which was just about a week and a half ago, everybody kept asking, who's going to swear you in? Who's going to swear you in? And I had Jackie Goldberg swear me in, and I didn't want to say that prior. I just said, it's going to be a surprise. So it was interesting. So it's like you keep coming out in different ways. But it was pretty weird for me because I've always been open about who I am. So it was weird not to be able to say that or put that on my card and worry every day when the mail came. Am I going to get hit, by this mayor who's going to say we cannot have a gay person, running our city?
Interesting. Actually, Drian, that brings to mind a story that you told me about when you came out. I mean, you kind of let, I think it was when you were at school at Otis College. And when you came out, it was a teacher who approached you and said, hey, I'm getting a lot of questions. This is before you transitioned. What should I say to them? Can you tell us more about that story and essentially how she kind of came out for you? What was your reaction?
So, for me, I just wanted to be myself. And so I was dressing in a way that I was comfortable. I was wearing makeup. And I really didn't think about how that was affecting anybody else. I just was thinking, this is how I'm comfortable. But a lot of the students, again, I think it goes back to that people put a label on you, and then it's hard for them to let go of that label. So even when you come out as trans, then you just become all trans. Everything you do is trans. Your whole entire life is nothing but trans, and it's only one small part of who we are as humans. And so for me, when I was in college, that's what was happening. Students didn't know what pronoun to use, what bathroom was I going to use, do they, refer to me as she or him, or what was going on. And so it was because of the students not knowing what label to put on me that my instructor came to me and said, this is what's happening and what's going on with you. Is this something you want to talk about openly? And that was the first time anybody had come to me and asked me what I wanted. And that was really exciting for me. I wanted to be out, but I just didn't know how. And so that was really the opportunity to let people know who I really was. And that's when I changed my name to Drian and started taking on female pronouns and sort of living my life as I am now. But it's interesting how it's always about other people's labels of you, whether they've got it right or wrong, and they're needing to know what is the right or wrong thing for you.
How do you take it now? I mean, you work at the LA Gay and Lesbian Center. You deal with this on a daily basis. You hear from people stories about this. I guess what do people who do have questions about, whatever your status is? I don't want to necessarily label you. It's your choice to label how you each want to label. But I guess how do you strike that balance between trying to be open about it and being friendly about it without saying like, oh, I'm so sick of answering these questions?
I think it's about changing our language. And so not being so heterocentric and assuming that somebody has either a male or a female pronoun. A lot of gender neutral language is, either just using that person's name or they. So instead of assuming that I have a male partner, you ask if you have a partner, if you're in a relationship. And I think it's about learning to communicate with each other in a way that isn't putting an identity on someone, but rather letting them self-identify and tell you eventually what their life is like, what their pronoun is, what their name is. So.
Hi, my name is Aaron Sines, and I'm the president of San Gabriel Valley Pride and treasurer at the Pasadena Pride Center. And one of the topics that we talked about today was small towns around the country and what they can do to support, people coming out. And people don't like to hear it, but Pasadena is a pretty small town, and the San Gabriel Valley is a huge area. What can cities like Pasadena and Azusa and Duarte and other cities like that are still small but yet connected to the big LA, what can they do to support people coming out? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Well, in response to your question, I do a lot of speaking engagements at several universities in the rural South, like in Statesboro, Georgia, and Milledgeville, Georgia, places that maybe are very far from Atlanta or any major metropolitan area. And I've definitely, and being part of those campus communities and being on campus, seeing the struggle the LGBTQ students have had, as well as the diversity departments have on those campuses to even keep those kind of like a climate alive. One thing that I've seen them do in Statesboro particularly is they've actually developed a kind of like LGBTQ pocket guide, like a kind of guide about like places in that particular area that are LGBTQI affirming, you know? And so that was something that's really been useful for them in terms of getting things out to people. And like, you know, it's something you can really kind of slip to somebody's pocket and like, you know, because this is still a very conservative area, right? So I've seen that happen in a lot of small rural towns, like trying to build networks and trying to build some kind of a small resource that can be passed along to people who may be, you know, in communities where they might be ostracized or where it's very rural and very small. So that's one thing I've seen.
For me, I think it's always about inclusive protection. So making sure that employment non-discrimination policies include gender identity and sexual orientation. Usually it's just sexual orientation. Ensuring that people are able to go to the restroom that is in alignment with their gender identity. So just putting that on the book so that people have protection, I think creates an environment where people feel like they can come out or they can be themselves. So I think legislatively supporting inclusive policies is important. AB 1266, which is the school bill allowing trans students to participate in school activities in their chosen identity. Something like that is really important to start changing the culture and saying you can be whoever you want and still be accepted in school and still be valid. So I think that's definitely an important step.
Hi, my name is Matthew Atha. I'm 23 and I live in Pasadena. I think one of the questions that I wanted to ask for our panelists was, one thing I've noticed kind of in my coming out process and just as I've become more familiar with the LGBTQI community, that there's kind of a white gay male centered viewpoint on what the LGBT community is supposed to look like. And kind of, I'm wondering how can white gay men like myself better affirm people of color and also transgender and bisexual individuals within our community?
My first question would be, response would be, how would you like to do that work? Or how are you willing to do that work? Because I think that I get that question a lot from people who kind of like embody privilege in relationship to where I am and like in terms of being a black queer person. I think it's very case by case basis. I think the first most important thing to do that I have learned in my work with like working with women and around sexism is that learning to listen more than I talk is really, really important. But it's very a case by case scenario, and you are going into delicate territory when you begin talking about the racial tensions that exist within the LGBTQ community, the gender tensions that are very real, like the ways in which we don't even talk about the racial and the gender divisions between our communities. There's really tension between lesbian and gay male communities. One of the things I used to say is we talk all the time about, I think Dr. Martin Luther King said, or somebody who said that on Sunday mornings, it's the most segregated time in like America. Well, I would say that like if you think about Saturday nights in like the gay community, like it's very segregated along the lines of gender. Like you're not gonna see a lot of mixed parties and spaces. And so I think that to answer your question, I think the biggest part is to do a little bit of listening, do your own kind of research and learning, and to show up and be supportive of other people who in your community who are doing those things. Like for instance, if there are lesbian women who are doing things in their community, like to show up and support, But it looks different for different people. But just kind of figuring out what you're willing to do, being willing to listen, and being willing to support.
And Lisa, what's your take on this? As a lesbian, what do you see the relationship with gay men? And is there a tension there? Do you explain what you think of that?
I think they generally don't mix as well. I mean, we're often grouped by straight people as, oh, that's just the gay people. We're all grouped together, but in reality, we don't really socialize even. And I think it's, in terms of changing that, it would just be what you're saying, listening and supporting each other. I think that's.
Mm-hmm. No, go ahead, Joe.
This is something that's been bothering me for a long time, is why there isn't more connection between, for lack of, non-heterosexual men and women. I once went to a lesbian bar to wait for a lesbian friend, and they just about threw me out. I think a lesbian and a gay male bar would probably be more welcome. It's just been my personal experience that gay men are more comfortable with women, whether they're gay or straight. And most of the lesbians that I've known socially tend to shy away from being with men very much. They'll accept invitations to, this is a very generalization, accepting an invitation to a party and not showing up and things of that sort. And I've even pointed it out at the Gay and Lesbian Center in the senior program that I'd like to see more gay men and lesbians and bi or whatever spending time together rather separately. And Kathleen knows I've mentioned, why do we have a separate movie for men and a separate movie for women? Why can't they see the same movie? You know, yeah, I really wanted to see, what's the Eve Ensler play?
Vagina Monologues.
The Vagina Monologues, and I was told I couldn't come to see it. So I got it from Netflix, and I saw it anyway. But the point I'm making is I would love to see more communal, just as people. I know we may have slightly different problems, but why can't we even discuss those?
Does that partly explain some of the tension that there is, as we heard earlier, with bisexual people who want to come out, with transgender, with intersex, et cetera?
Well, like I said, I think first place, I think it's the labels. You know, if we just got rid of all those labels, we just came together and talked. I mean, what's the difference if my grandfather came from Russia and yours came from Ireland? That doesn't have to be a reason why we can't communicate. And I think we got rid of the, you know, like, am I supposed to identify myself as a Russian, Polish, English, German, Austrian, American? It doesn't make any sense. You know, I mean, just, so all these labels are things that are bothering me now, and I think they're going to be more destructive than they are informative. We're just people.
You know, as you were speaking, so a lot of my work is centered around gay men's sexism. And one of the things I will say about gay men, gay male bars in terms of letting women in, it depends on what kind of woman comes in the door. Because if it's a woman who's not performing normative femininity, if she's not like performing like, you know, this high femme, like I've seen some very hostile situations in gay bars where if a butch lesbian or a butch woman comes into a gay bar, there is a level of hostility and resentment. And I think we also have to recognize, I think as a queer gay man, I think it's also important that we understand that a part of the reason that the divide around like lesbian and queer men, lesbian and gay men is because of the sexism and misogyny of gay male culture that is often kind of passed off or denied as the sexism that it is. I mean, I have heard like, there's an article I wrote called Gay Men's Sexism in Women's Bodies. And there is a lot of sexism and misogyny in terms of the ways in which the things we say about women's bodies, the way we police women's bodies, trans and cis women's bodies, the expectations of normative femininity. I've heard gay men say the most vile and horrid things in terms of like, policing women to be like, oh, you gotta be more pretty like this, or you need to like, your body needs to look like this, you know? And so I think in order for us to create a space for us to come together and be able to kind of cross those lines, we have to interrogate our privilege. That's how we kind of get across the lines, whether it's racial, whether it's gender, whether it's cis, we have to interrogate our privilege and check ourselves around the gay male misogyny, because I think that like when I talk to a lot of my lesbian sisters, they tell me like, you know, we don't want gay men in this space because they come in here and they're nasty. They think it's okay to call us certain language that we don't find okay, whether it's the B word, whether it's touching and grabbing my body, they think it's acceptable. Like there's all these different things that I hear from them that often gay men, you know, we don't listen to because we're in that privileged position. We don't have to listen. And I think that it's important that we understand, one, we are still men and we have a certain level of social privilege that we exploit. And if we want to actually create communities with women, we need to, like with lesbian women, we need to check ourselves and listen more.
There's another question over there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Tim E.B. McKenzie. I'm a marriage and family therapist practicing in the LA area. I work with a lot of teens from a number of different ethnic and racial backgrounds. I'm also a graduate from Fuller and very active in the church. One of the things that I have noticed in working with quite a number of teens is an increasing ability to come out to friends, to come out to family, come out to parents. Incredibly difficult time coming out within the church. And so I'm wondering if you could speak some to the dynamics of coming out within the church, what you see as some of the barriers, difficulties, successes, how you've seen that work and not work. Yeah.
Well, I think the church is, you know, I mean, for obvious reasons, there are some churches that are going to tell you that if you come out, you come out and they're already, you know, they frame homosexuality as a sin. Then obviously coming out, you're coming out as sort of an addict, or, you know, someone kind of bearing yourself to be rejected, and that's always scary in any community, to know that this is a deal breaker for people, and this is your family. At least for me, growing up in church, they were like my family, and it was so closely knit, and the idea that I would be considered the other, or I would be considered different from this community was so it was scary, and it was something I wasn't, and a lot of people aren't willing to tread that territory because they just don't want to be considered different. And typically, I think a lot of people in that place will kind of live double lives, and will be a certain way with their friends, and be another way at church. And some people have become very comfortable with that. But for me, at least, it was too difficult to live sort of two separate lives and to not reconcile that.
Yeah, and you were dealing with that when I think you were in San Diego. I can't remember exactly where. You were. What were you doing at that school? You were kind of like a youth leader in terms of.
Yeah, I think I was a part of a lot of the campus fellowships at UC San Diego, and I think, and I was also in a relationship with somebody at my church, a girl at my church, and of course that was all under wraps, and nobody knew about it. We were both leaders. I was. Everybody in the Korean community knew my dad, and so I think I went to San Diego thinking that I can run away from that sort of kind of being a bit more known, but everybody of course knew him, and it was kind of I tried very hard to drop hints to my community that maybe I'm gay, what would that look like for you? How would you respond? And so my junior year, I took part in the Day of Silence at UC's. It's a day where students wear black to kind of commemorate those who have been silenced by violence and because of their sexual orientation. And we wear black, and we are silent the whole day. Word got out that, I don't know how, people found out that I took part in this, and it was so strange because it was a personal choice, but people found out, and I was asked to step down from worship ministries or my leadership positions unless I publicly apologized. And this wasn't because they thought that I was gay myself, but that I was an ally, or in some way supportive or condoning this, for them, lifestyle choice. And so it was interesting that at that point I was like, so that's how you would respond to even the idea that I would be supportive. And so I was going to be, that pushed me further into the closet.
What do you think would help people like yourself in a Korean church? Is there any kind of shift that you can imagine might push a church like yours to be more open, more accepting?
I mean, it would just, it would have to be people who are gay or who are, LGBTQI to come out, and that step to be visible, to pose some sort of, to introduce the idea that we're there, and that it's something that they need to deal with as a community. And I think, outside of that, for me, I've come out. I've stepped out of my church for several years now. I haven't been going to church, mainly because I know that I wouldn't be welcome there. My girlfriend wouldn't be welcome there, and it breaks my heart. A lot of people say, just go to a gay affirming church. That's so easy. But for me, it doesn't make sense because I grew up with this church. This is my family, and for someone to say to go to a different family, it just doesn't register for me. If it's not this church, it's not church at all for me. And so I think me coming out and being very visible for people in my church, even though as an outsider, sort of as an outsider insider, people have, a lot of my old church members who are gay or who are lesbian will come to me and come out to me privately I think even if you're going to step out of your church, you just got to be visible so that people know where to go for help.
Hi, my name is Kathy Lamb, and I'm from a parent support group of the famous group that made really headline news this past week. We're from the Viet Rock group, Viet Rainbow of Orange County.
The group is actually having a strategy meeting tonight, so they can't be here. But I'm here just trying to find some answers, some help, to see how I can work with my own community, because we all identify ourselves as Vietnamese American. And so, like you said, it was hard because, you know, we don't identify ourselves with this parade, like, go do your own parade. It's not about that. It's about being in your own community. So I guess we still have a lot of bringing awareness, bringing education, because my son is gay, and I see a lot of young kids in our group that are being not accepted by their parents. They're very young, they're 18, and they get kicked out of the house. And, you know, looking at all the depression rate, suicidal rate, I really don't want, you know, to happen to our youth anymore. So last year, when the organizer decided that they don't want LGBT group to walk in the parade, you know, I start joining the group and be a support group. So in the Vietnamese American community, they always, you know, look at these younger people. When I said young, the board members about 30 to 35, so they're not young. And the youth group is 25 and under, and then there's a parents group. But for a few of us parents that finally step up to speak on the behalf of these, I quote, youth and children, it make a statement that, you know, they can't call these like, oh, they're just kids, you know? And in the old Vietnamese American, in the Vietnamese tradition, they keep thinking, you know, you have to respect your elder and things like that. But I can't let this to be silenced anymore. So, so I'm here to see if, you know, I guess we just have to continue to bring education and more awareness in our own community to figure it out, because we're really lagging behind, and it's really embarrassed to be seen as we're racist among our own race, you know? So it's really tough to be Vietnamese American right now. And Tet is the Vietnamese New Year, and it's always been about tradition. It's always about family. And the traditional value is not like that. It's always accepting. So just a small organizer that decide to hold a private event, which is touching the First Amendment right that everybody could walk. But to a lot of people, this is a community event. Mm-hmm. It's like a July 4th event that black people can't come. It's kind of the same analogy in a way, even though it's a private event. So no one can help us as far as not having another permit. The city, they told us that their hand is tied because of First Amendment right.
Can I ask you a question? So when it comes to being Vietnamese American, what does being gay mean in that community? And I asked this from the standpoint of, I talked with a gentleman who's creating a magazine for Asian American gay men, and his reasoning is that, well, if you Google gay Asian men, you get stuff that you can't necessarily show to your parents. So he wanted to create kind of an image of Asian American men that's successful, people in suits, people who are successful achievers, because he says, you know, from his parents' culture, they see people who are gay as, performers who are, I guess, lascivious, etc. But is it similar in the Vietnamese community?
I think so, because we always, want our kids, and I think that's partially is why it's harder for some of the youth to come out also, because they get this mold that the parents want them to be, the typical doctor and attorney and all that. And so if we just keep thinking that, okay, just be good at school, whatever you do, we'll get there. So a lot of the kids that have come out and not accepting by their parents at the time, they work really hard to prove to their parents that they're just like any other children. You know, they go to school, they have the same goals and dreams, and prove to their parents that gay is not being different. You know, we're not asking to be any different. We're just, our sexual orientation, our identity is different. So yeah, it's tough. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, for you, and I think the gentleman who asked about what to do in small towns or in Pasadena or whatever, if you see me afterwards, I'll talk to you about the organization for which I go to schools and speak, and maybe there's some way that we can help you with education, because I think that's all it takes is education. I think the homophobia and the racism and all of that stuff comes from lack of education, because we don't know what other people are. We just think of them as being different. And it might help if we just looked at the similarities rather than the differences. But I'm just preaching when I say that.
But I also think it's really important to commend you, because you're visible and you're somebody who other parents can go to. And I know for someone like my mom, there was no one like that. And so sometimes you can be that connection that opens people's minds up and hearts up. So thank you for being out there and for supporting. It's really what it's all about.
My name is Don. I live up the road a few miles. And I'd be interested in your prediction of when this whole subject might become passé. I mean, if you look back in history, all important people, including candidates, had to be WASPs. We finally let women vote. We finally counted African Americans as whole people. You just go through the list of how things that look like they're unchangeable will not change. Now, I imagine we're going to get in trouble when we start getting to pedophiles, but somewhere along the line, I would think, was 10 years or 50 or 100, is there any way people can sort of look at things and when people shake their heads and say, did they really believe things like that in those days?
Joe, can you answer this one? Because, I mean, you've seen like the most change, 84 years. You've seen the most change in America on that end. What do you think?
I love getting to this age. You know, I love getting this older, the elder statesman. I don't know how to predict this. I'm not Nostradamus. We're about the same age, but I mean, who's to know? I think that right now, I think things are moving much quicker than they have for a very long time. Remember, we've had heterosexuals, bisexuals, and trans, well, maybe not so many transgender in terms of what they could do about it, but people felt they were in the wrong bodies probably from the beginning of time. I mean, how do we know, who was doing what? I always wondered how Adam and Eve had grandchildren. And there's something strange about that. They only had, a couple of boys. And and that's been going on for, how many thousands of years. But I've seen the change is rapidly coming. Here, we had Stonewall, which was back in 1969. Now we're talking about gay marriage. That was just a bunch of so-called drag queens fighting the police and saying, we're not going to take it anymore. And now we're talking about, people getting married. Countries are coming out as saying it's okay for people of the same gender to become married. What is it, about a third of the states in the United States, the leading country in the world, has only a third of the countries saying it's okay. We've come a long, long way, and we still have a long way to go. Golly, I don't know how many more years I have to live, but in the short time that I have, I'd love to see everybody just getting along and end all this nonsense stuff. So I don't know if that's an answer, but that's the best I can do. I don't know. I don't know how many more years I'll have. I just bought a new car. So.
Hi, good evening. My name is Saida, and I have a lot of friends, straight female friends, who very often
categorize their gay male friends very separate than their other male friends. So they describe them as my gay husband, my gay boyfriend. And so there's this tendency to believe that every gay man or non-heterosexual man loves makeup, loves shopping, loves to gossip. And so I'm wondering, even in those very accepting and supportive communities, you continue to have to, I think, more as a gay male or non-heterosexual male, or as a lesbian who is sort of fairly feminine, who doesn't fit the traditional views of what a lesbian looks like. You continue to have to explain yourself, or you continue to have to fight these sort of these miscategories. But I'm wondering, as a gay male, do you ever find yourself having to explain or to fight those, or have those battles with your straight female friends?
Yes. And not just with my female friends. I've been like on a plane, and a woman sits next to me and tells me, "How's my foundation look? Do you think I should wear this color?" I'm like, "I don't know you. Why would you think that I know about foundation?" You know, or I will meet. I've been in like even in work situations where like, you know, someone has heard about, oh, YOLO's gay or whatever, and she'll come through and she'll be like, "Hey girlfriend, how you doing?" I'm like, what is happening right now? Like, what makes you think this is acceptable to talk to me like this, or that I want to go shopping with you, or that, you know, there's a lot of like, you know, stereotyping that happens in that dynamic. And oftentimes historically, there's this idea that like, you know, straight women and gay men are the bestest of friends, and it's all good. And like, actually, in some of those dynamics, there's a lot of like homophobia, a lot of like heterosexism, a lot of sexism, I would say too, and a lot of stereotyping. So I definitely have to push back against that with some of my straight female friends. I have to be very clear with them. Look, I'm not here to police the guys in the room to see who's not gay. I'm not here to do that for you. You know what I mean? I'm not an accessory. I'm not an accessory for you, and I'm not going to use you as an accessory, because gay men do that to straight women as well, or to femme women, I would say, is particularly. But yeah, it's something I definitely experience, and I constantly push back against. That like, I'm a human being. You like, just like you wouldn't want me to walk up to you and say something really sexist or misogynistic. Like, don't come to me with these assumptions about who I am just because you know about my sexuality.
It's all stereotyping. It's just pure stereotyping. Yeah. I do know a lot about show tunes. So I have some straight male friends who know a lot about show tunes. You know, but I've never had that experience where I felt like I was arm candy. I wish. And I've always had a lot of women in my life, as I've said before, but I never gave them makeup tips. I wouldn't know how. Yeah, we might cook something together occasionally, but basically we're just, you know, who we are, and just, you know, and I understand where you're coming from too, but you know, that's just life. I mean, we're stereotypes are based on some kind of truth. It's just that they're not always applied to the people to whom they apply, in a sense. So that's all I have to say on that.
You know, on that end, I mean, if being gay, being lesbian, whatever, I mean, it's obviously there are total stereotypes out there, and not everybody fits those. If you don't fit those, I wonder, do you have an obligation to come out and kind of identify, yes, I am this kind of person, and yes, we're very different. I think actually both you, Elisa and Joe, you mentioned this as important to you both. I mean, you want to come out just to make sure that people can recognize that there are LGBT people out there that you might not realize are. How important is that? Do you want to try this first, Elisa?
I think we were talking about the question of whether coming out in the future, you know, when it's more widely acceptable, if it's even necessary. And I felt like, at least on a personal level, it's something that I would still like to do, because it's almost like when you verbalize it to someone else, you accept that part of yourself, you're identifying with it. To speak it out, it's very, I think it solidifies that about your identity. So I think yes, you would always need to, not necessarily need to, but it's good to come out. It's good to speak it out. And maybe, I don't know, I mean, we all talked about labels, how they can be, you know, limiting, and but sometimes it's empowering. Yeah.
Yeah, I love telling this story. Back in the early 70s, when I first got here from New York, while I was looking for what I considered a real job, I was teaching dancing. Anybody watch Dancing with the Stars? Okay. In the early days of the show, remember they rehearsed in a studio with half-round windows? I taught there. It's on 3rd Street. And I met a very lovely woman, and she became my pupil, and eventually she invited me to some social occasion and introduced me to her sister. I immediately figured out, uh-oh, this is a date. You know, she's fixing me up with her sister. So I just told them I was gay and got it over with. Years and years and years later, her sister, by the way, both women had died last year, but years later at a birthday party for Goldie, who's the woman I was talking about, Norma, her sister, her younger sister, said to me, "Joe, do you realize how much you impacted our family?" And I said, "Is that like a wisdom tooth? Or, I mean, what I impacted?" And she said, "Well, you're the first gay person we knew, openly gay person." And I said, "No, that's not true, because you knew your nephew Gary was gay, and he talked about it." She said, "Not the same way. We knew what Gary was doing, but," she said, "you came out differently." She said, "You normalized it for us." And I love that. Now, a lot of gay people don't want to be normalized. They want to be different. I thought it was wonderful just hearing that I normalized something. And so my mission, as I said, I come out to everybody every chance I get. Have always loved children, still do. When my friends at a certain age started to get married and have kids, all the children tended to call me Uncle Joe Levy. It was one word, Uncle Joe Levy. Those kids are now grandparents, and they still call me Uncle Joe Levy. And they know that I'm gay, and I think they're very open to other people who are. And so to me, coming out is extremely important, and it's almost like a mission, as I said. And I think if everybody knows a gay person, they're less likely to go into that thing about they must be terrible people, because they're no longer they become a him or a her.
Hi, my name is Ashan, and I just wanted to say that there was a question about religion and how can we move religious institutions forward, and there's a question about how long will it take for us to actually accept all these different kinds of people. And I think it's the same question, because it seems that what we constantly do is reproduce ways to marginalize people as time goes on. So we'll accept the G, but we won't accept the L. We'll accept the L, but we won't accept the B. We'll accept the B, but we won't accept the T. And we keep reproducing this cycle. And so what we need to be focused on, I think, is a different understanding of justice that emerges from not how can you account for me and how can you care for me, but how can we account for people in the world, and how can we do justice for people in the world? How can we do things that allow people to exist viably, that have vibrant lives, that are full and free, and that displaces our personal need for personal comfort and says that what we need is for everyone to feel some sense of comfort, some sense of love, some sense of acceptance, which is justice. And so then it doesn't become about me as a certain kind of racialized, gendered subject and you as a racialized, gendered subject, but that we both occupy space on this thing called Earth for a short amount of time, and how can we do what we can do in a short amount of time in order to promote living in healthy and viable ways. And I think that'll disrupt sort of these religious institutions that think it's about me and mine, about my form of Christianity over and against your form of Christianity, or my Christianity over and against your Islam, or my Islam over and against your Buddhism. And it also disrupts my form of whiteness over and against your form of blackness, my form of maleness over and against your form of femaleness, my form of cisgenderness over and against your form of transgenderness. And so what we have to do, I think, is really reframe what are the stakes of the things that we're actually talking about? Because I don't think we should ever only be talking about coming out of the closet as LGBT, because there's this thing called an intersectional analysis where we're talking about your race, class, gender, your sexual orientation. You're also talking about your religious institutions. You're talking about your sort of educational status, your status in terms of citizenship as well. And so once we begin to try to account for all those things, I think we can, one, move religious institutions forward, but also we can even displace the question, how long is it going to take? It's going to take as long as humans are on the planet, because we'll always be having to work for the thing called justice.
Actually, when you bring that up, give them those applause. Actually, when you bring that up, it just had me thinking about in the research for this. Back in 2007, I think it was when the LGBT non-discrimination bill first went through Congress. That failed, but one of the takeaways I had was looking through comments online. I think this is and Adrienne, I'll turn to you for this, for part of this, is that initially the transgender protections were taken out. And the reaction I saw online was a little surprising, because there were gay men, I think specifically, who were saying like, that's okay, we'll protect them later, let's just take this now. Essentially, let's take what we have, period, move on, we'll help them later. Whereas transgender people were commenting back, we've been part of this struggle this entire time, you should not leave us behind. Adrienne, can you talk about that in terms of, I guess, that sort of sense of unity? These are all letters, they aren't necessarily unified, but when it comes to the outside world, yes, they are. Can you talk about how, for transgender people, they've had it rough. They've had it way more rough than LGBT people, or LGB people.
And the interesting thing is that, as it was mentioned earlier, trans people have always existed. There has always been a third gendered, Hydra, Berdash, Nadle. There's been tons and tons of names for people who embodied both masculine and feminine energy. But much through colonization, that was something that was demonized and seen as something that was bad. And I think we're going to get to the point, to talk to your point, where we're going to have so many labels that it's going to be, a 20-letter acronym. And for me, I really like something that Terence McKenna said. He said, and I've taken on the pronoun transhuman, because he said, are we too human to be transhuman? Are we too stuck in our own labels and ideas to go beyond that and just accept each other as human beings? And that's what I think is so exciting about the queer community, because the queer community really does have that diversity and fluidity to say, I want to be this way today or this way tomorrow, and that's okay. And I think they're really normalizing that concept of you can be however and whoever you want to be, and that doesn't mean that it's fixed forever. But I think in mainstream societies, that's a very difficult concept for people to get. And for them, it's all about the labels in your body parts. And part of why Enda died was because the argument became, well, then what bathroom are trans people going to use? Should we have genital verification before we'll allow a trans woman to go into the women's restroom? And is that safe for women if we have a trans woman who doesn't have a vagina in the bathroom with them? And so we're so fixated on what people's body parts look like and what they do with them. And so we get lost in that instead of just accepting the human being. And I think that's sort of where we're at right now. We're at that crossroads where I think that is growing, where people are saying you can just be whoever and however you want to be, and that can change from day to day, and that's okay. So I think that discussion needs to grow.
Do we have time for several more questions?
And then one more.
Okay.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Chris Franzullo. I'm 28 and bi. And my question for the panel is, I've already come out to my parents, and I came out by accident. I was accidentally outed by one of the housing staff at my college. But I was participating in a gender-neutral housing community, an intentional LGBT-safe community on campus during the period of time that I was, discovering my own orientation. And I've already come out of that closet to my friends. I've already come out of the closet to my parents. But ironically, the community I've not come out to is my broader LGBT community, and I don't participate nearly as much as I would like to. Does the panel have any suggestions on how to overcome my own anxieties about being rejected as a bisexual individual, to move beyond my own anxieties and fears to participate in this work?
We don't know. We don't know why we'll be accepted. We don't know why we'll be rejected. It could be the color of your skin. It could be the shape of your eyes. It could be the way I wear my hair. It could be anything. What's the difference? You'll be rejected by some people. You'll be accepted by some people. Maybe the ones who reject you may get to know you, and the rejection will disappear. It's a gamble. It's a gamble. Personally, I take the chance. And I can't think of anybody who ever rejected me for that reason, except maybe one person, and I'm not even sure about her. But it's been very fortunate that I've been open. I think people maybe just accept the fact that I'm honest, because how many of us are honest most of the time or all of the time? I would say at your age and whatever, I would say just keep trying it and see how it works.
Out of curiosity, what do people say to you if you have come out as bisexual, or have you just heard enough that you think, ooh, maybe I shouldn't?
Yeah, I have a few straight friends who just can't wrap their mind around the concept of being bisexual and what that means to me. And I have a hard time explaining it because, to me, personality is more important than gender and what I find attractive in another human being.
Mm-hmm. And do they also fully accept people who come out as lesbian or gay? It's just bisexual they get hung up on?
They get hung up on bisexual more than lesbian or gay. Lesbian or gay, they seem to have a narrow understanding of what that is, and they don't fear it. They don't understand it per se, and they don't necessarily even accept it, but they don't fear it. I have a feeling that they fear my bisexuality because they don't understand what it is.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Jessica, and first of all, I'd like to thank the panel very much because this has been an amazing experience. My daughter came out this past year hesitantly. She's a lesbian in an extremely small college community in Indiana. Alyssa, and I like to address the religion issue, extremely Catholic her whole life. Very youth leader. One of the reasons she went to that university was because of her religion. She brought all of her family, my husband and I and her sister, closer to the church. And once she realized and she came out unto her own self, loving the church and knowing the rules of the church and believing them like wholeheartedly, she's removed herself from the church because she totally believed it, and it was heartbreaking as her mother to see this, to something that brought her so much joy, and for her to say, I can't be part of this because I love it and respect it so much, and I understand and accept those rules. More so, not even willing to be a hypocrite about it and not willing to play any games, and coming out and saying, I am no longer part of this church, still loving it and respecting it and admiring it. And I appreciate this evening because as her parent, you're reinforcing how I respect her strength and what a special person she is. And so sadly, I don't think there's a middle ground for us within churches that are established, large churches. I think as her parent, my husband and I and her sister are extremely supportive of her, but we don't even feel we have a place in a church that we grew up in, and it was our culture. It was not only was it our religion, it was our culture. And we no longer feel comfortable. And it's a very sad place to be in, and until those beautiful things that have been said happen, maybe we can become more human. I don't see us changing religion. Hopefully everything else will.
Actually, go ahead.
I think something that Gene Robinson, who's the first gay bishop in the Episcopal denomination, something that he said really stuck with me for a really long time. And the reason my parents aren't supportive, they're not, they still consider it sin, and they are very aggressive about it at times. And the only reason that I feel like I can weather those interactions is something that he said about what it means to look like family, what it means to look Christ-like as a church, as a family, is when you cling together even more tightly when you disagree. And what it means to hold fiercely to each other in disagreement, that's when you kind of represent this sort of Christ-like identity. And I think that spoke to me because even though I disagree with my parents, even though I disagree with my church, I'm willing to kind of navigate the reconciliation process because I believe that there's a process and that's the end goal. I think it's going to happen. I just think it's a long way to go, but if you're willing to take it, you should always walk together with people even if you disagree.
So I think we have to wrap up. We're at 9:00. But I really want to thank all of you for coming. And as you heard, some of the responses that we got were from the Public Insight Network. I want to give a shout out to Ashley, who's right back there. You can't really see her, it's dark. But I really want to stress that part of this conversation could not have been done without her and her work on gathering people in the community to share their own experiences. If you'd like to be part of the network, please go see her or fill out a form. You can give us your experience, either LGBT, you aren't necessarily that either. You could be a doctor, a parent, etc. Share whatever experience that you feel like KPCC or any other news organization around the nation could turn to you for expertise. I also want to thank Elaine for bringing this whole panel together. So thank you, Elaine. Yeah. And I never thought we were going to actually find an answer about how to make it easier for people to come out, but during this experience, it was just really fascinating to hear the different kinds of stories that are out there that I don't think are necessarily represented in mass media, pop culture. So I really want to appreciate all of you for joining us this evening. So thanks again.